as we mentioned, we have some folks here from DPR. A little bit of background on DPR. They are an employee-owned company. They have experienced explosive growth in particularly in the last 10 years. They also have been leaders in the implementation of advanced lean principles, practices within the industry, which has been, I'm sure, contributing to the growth that they have experienced. So, anyway, we'd like to introduce you to Chris Bell. He leads the self-perform groups. I'll let him explain what that means in the southeast region of DPR. He lives in Orlando, Florida. Graduated from Purdue with a CEM degree in 2004. And worked his way up from a project manager to a project executive, although they don't have titles in their company. But to explain to you what the function is, before jumping in with the self-perform work, he's been with DPR for 13 years. And then Drew Emerson, and Drew will go ahead and introduce himself.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Drew Emerson. I'm also a project executive. I work alongside Chris in Orlando, Florida. Really great to be back at Purdue. And what I do for the company is I primarily oversee multiple construction projects. So I have teams that are organized on project sites, getting projects built. And my responsibility is to make sure that they're properly staffed, they're supported, they're getting the training and mentoring they need, they have all the correct resources, they're executing the company's best practices for building projects. And then I'm also responsible for customer relationships. Chris and I share a couple of other roles within the company, but in the interest of time, I think we'll dive right in our presentation. And if we have time to catch up with you about some of the things specific to DPR, then we'll do that. But in the interest of time, we want to get started because we want to make this interactive today. So we're going to ask for some participation from the audience. And along the way, if you have any questions about anything we're talking about, don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask. We love that, right? So this is not a rehearsed or scripted presentation by any stretch of imagination. So any input from you guys would be great. So we'll just jump right in on that first slide.
Yeah. So hopefully this is CEM324. We're here to talk a little bit about human resource management. I know you guys have been studying, here so far this semester. So we'll go right into.
Right. So to get started, I was hoping I could get a volunteer to read this paragraph for me real quickly out loud. Is anybody willing to do that? Okay, so from way back in the back. Good for you. See, I couldn't read that from back there.
Except in the middle of a battlefield, nowhere must men coordinate the movement of other men and all materials in the midst of such chaos and with such limited certainty of present facts and future occurrences as in huge construction projects. Even the most painstaking planning frequently turns out to be more mere conjecture, and accommodation to changes must necessarily be of the rough, quick, and
ad hoc, sorry. That's, I think I looked up the ad. Sorry, ad hoc, sorry. I was supposed to say ad hoc. My typo.
analogous or
Yep.
analogous to ever-changing commands on the battlefield.
Yeah, so that's kind of a long quote, right? But I think it's really applicable to what we're here to talk about today in human resource management and lean practices in construction industry. This is a quote from an attorney in closing arguments in a claims case on a construction project from back in 1981. And I really love it because it actually takes the construction industry and compares it to fighting a war. I mean, think about the chaos and the uncertainty in fighting a war. And this attorney literally compared that to the construction. He talked about things like limited certainty, coordinating the movement of men, and always having to accommodate changes no matter when or how they occur, right? So what does that just scream when you think about those kinds of variables in an effort, right? And something you're trying to produce? What do you think about is what does that involve? That involves the use of people, correct? To deal with coordinating, thinking about risk and uncertainty, and accommodating change, that all requires people, right? Machines can't do that work. Technology can't do that work. It takes people. Okay, so the reason that quote is applicable, and I think this human resources and lean practices are important in the industry and field of construction, is because for teams to be a success, that you need to select the right members, right? The project team needs to be made up of the right kinds of people. Not only technical expertise, the personality, right? How well they interact with other people, who are good leaders and who are good followers. Okay, so setting clear expectations. I don't know if that's something you've specifically talked about in this class, but one of the things that fails when new teams are assembled and people work together for the first time is they fail to sit across the table from each other and talk about what we expect from you, or each other, right? There's always a relationship that's built on trust, but expectations, and those expectations can only be met if you're aware of them. Good listening skills. Obviously, teams are going to not function well if they aren't listening to one another's needs, right? If you put yourself in a silo or you put yourself in a box and you try to operate in a team environment, something is going to get missed, or maybe people aren't going to work efficiently because two people are doing the same thing. So you have to communicate and you have to listen. It's important to be proactive about giving feedback. So if a team member is not living up to the expectations, or if the team member is not listening, or maybe the team member's personality is causing a conflict within the team dynamic, feedback is always important. Difficult conversations are really hard to have sometimes, especially if you have a relationship with someone and you've been working with that person for a long time. The hardest thing to do can be to sit down across from them and say, hey, you're detrimental to the team. What you're doing here is hurting our ability to perform. We're not operating in a lean way because we're not being efficient because of your behavior. But it's very important to give it because you can correct the ship, right the ship before it sinks. And then we're going to talk for a little bit about proper planning today as well, and how important it is to plan the work and not just go into it ad hoc, as they say.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit today about how DPR's approach to solving some of these problems that Drew was outlining, and just some of the things that we put together to help our employees tackle these challenges. And what Drew was talking about there at the end, in terms of proper planning, this is kind of a triangle that we developed about planning, scheduling, and production planning, and how all those things kind of work together. And it's what we call that, we talk in a lot of acronyms at DPR, so forgive me if I start talking in a language you don't understand. But we call that PSPP, planning, scheduling, and production planning. And it's really the power of and, how they all work together symbiotically. But this isn't a scheduling class, right? So we're not going to go back to Dr. Abraham's Primavera class or whatever and start talking about scheduling. This is really, all of this is really about people and behaviors. A scheduling tool is just that, a tool. But there are people that have to prepare it. There are people that have to understand it. There are people that have to enact it, right? And so it's really all about people and behaviors when we're talking about planning, scheduling, and production planning, and ways to solve some of these problems that we see on construction sites. And so just in somewhat quick fashion here, it's not necessarily important to retain all of this knowledge that I'm going to click through, but we have 7 standards that we say of PSPP, and we're going to dive into a few of them into some detail. But just real quickly here, there are 7 standards. Right people. So again, things based on trust and behaviors and measuring how we work together. Planning first, which is starting with the plan, not just starting with digging in the ground, right? And getting aligned on that plan. The right amount of detail in a schedule and in the communication. Again, I'm clicking through these kind of fast. It's not as important to retain all of this knowledge, but just to give you an idea. Managing the schedule, so making sure that we're updating things as we go along through the project. Communicating, right communication, making sure people are getting the right communication of the plan, of the schedule, of the thing we're trying to accomplish. Managing production, we're going to dive into some of that during today in terms of what we mean by managing production. And then protecting the plan. So if we have the right plan, if we're communicating effectively, if we're working as a team together, then we should all be making sure that we're protecting that plan and not letting anything attack it and destroy it, right?
So Chris, before you move on, I think all of these principles, and this is a DPR specific kind of approach to planning projects, But all of these principles, what really kind of related to me when we were thinking about this presentation today was that all of these, you don't see anything on here that's a technical skill like approving a concrete mix design or you know, keystroking something into a computer or some form of technology that does a job for you. These all require people. And having the people that have the skills and the abilities to implement all of these things to make a project success without relying on, they certainly use computers and they use technology, but it really takes people to make all of these things happen. Not one of them can happen without the right people.
Any questions so far? Anything? Feel free to raise your hand or shout out or anything if you have questions as we go along. So like I mentioned, we're gonna dive into just a few of these principles in some detail. So the first one we wanted to talk about was that first principle on the pie there, the right people. And so what do we really mean when we're talking about right people? Again, it's developing a team based on trust. And as Drew mentioned sort of before, making sure everybody is aligned around what their role on the project is, what they're responsible for on the project. And communicating that and defining it, writing it down, making sure everybody understands. And then just as important as the folks that are managing the project or the folks that are building the project. So when we talk about right people, it's not just the manager that's approving the pay request. It's also the craft. It's also the guy that's hanging the drywall, that's wiring the switch. And we want to make sure that we have a means to actually get feedback from the field. We don't want to be making all these decisions and having all these team members interacting without even considering what's happening out in the field with the guy that's actually swinging the hammer or running the screw, right?
Yeah, I don't want to overshadow that implementing all these things causes you to be more efficient, right? The idea is that if you don't do these things, something's going to get lost or broken or not happen right. And if you do implement these things, the idea is going to be that you work more efficiently because you're doing everything right the first time and you're doing it with the fewest amount of resources as possible.
Correct, yeah. The last point here is just as important as defining the roles and communicating amongst the team is developing a process so you can actually measure the success and then find ways to improve that and implement those changes for improvement. And so that's really about the right people. And to give you some examples of what we're talking about, I wanted to talk real briefly about a project we just wrapped up for a client that we can't tell you about, but you probably know who it is. This is a project that was a multi-year project, had varying types of construction. It was an IPD project, which is the integrated project delivery method, where it was actually a poly-party agreement where 12 different firms signed one agreement, and we became truthfully one team, even though it was 12 different companies. And so having the right people and having the right team members present and working together was very important. Just some pictures here to give you an idea of what kind of project it was. These are hotel rooms, and this is a cabin actually, a very expensive cabin.
How many of those cabins did we do?
26.
26 of those cabins on that project.
So the example I wanted to get to was this is a chart showing scores. The team scored each other each month on these different criteria that we consider key performance indicators to determine if the team was functioning the way we wanted it to function. And so things, like decision making, right? How is the team doing with decision making? Are we making decisions on time? Are we making them, is the right person making the decision, right? Co-location. So in this particular project, again, I mentioned it was IPD, we had all the different firms physically in the same office trailer and trailer complex. And so how was the co-location working? Were people actually coming and working in that co-located trailer, or were they still staying at their offices back wherever their offices are? Were we communicating effectively in that co-location? And so this is just an example of the team set up metrics and then scored each other each month, reviewed it, talked about areas of improvement, and then figured out what to do to improve those. And hopefully, some of the scores start to get better as time goes on, right? Yes?
What does latency mean? Or latency? What is that?
Yeah, latency. So it's really just another word for laziness. Just not getting things accomplished, right? Just letting things slide, letting things sit. Getting complacent is also a term in there, right? So just getting everything's fine. We don't need to do anything. We don't need to improve. Measuring how how we're behaving in that section. Any other questions? So again, this is an example of getting the right people and then making sure we're communicating about how we're interacting and improving that process throughout the project.
So again, we keep this as a key term, right? Communication. Communication is key to success. I really believe that. And so we've got a couple things here. Developing a project communication plan. That may sound a little unnecessary or cumbersome, but when you think about it, every construction project you assemble a new project team from the contractor. You might be working with a new client. That client has hired an architect that you may never have worked with before. And then the contractor is going to go out and hire a group of subs. And those subs may have worked for that contractor before or not, and they may not have worked with each other. So you could have an entirely new team of people that have never worked together before, and they have to go and figure out how to fight this battle. Remember the quote from the beginning? Literally engage in war. And you want to do that efficiently and effectively to maximize everybody's profits and the success of the project. So it's important to develop a communication plan, and nowadays especially, and I'm sure you guys have been exposed to this in other classes, this wasn't something I was exposed to when I was at Purdue, but utilizing collaborative visual planning. And that's really important. So that's where the tool of technology comes into play a lot, where you do BIM models and fly-throughs, and you can do sections through the building to understand how it's going to get built before you're actually there building it. And then utilizing supplemental project reporting and controls to raise awareness. Why do you think it's important to keep people informed on what's going on in the project? Anybody have an idea? Well, one reason that you want to keep people informed is because someone might notice something that's not going correctly, and they can catch it before it's too late or before it snowballs into a worse problem than it already is. So if you'll go to the next slide, Chris. This is a report that we're using tailored to a project that we're building in Jacksonville right now. It's the MD Anderson Cancer Center. It's a rather large, it's actually the largest hospital project that we have on the whole East Coast right now. It's about a year from being complete. And this is a report that the team puts out every week on Friday. It's an especially useful tool on this particular project because DPR does not have a regional office in Jacksonville. So that team is working remote from the corporate or the regional office of the company. The architect is from out of town on the project. And the project team all travels, well not all, but several of the members of the project team travel in from out of town. So there's a lot of moving parts on the project where people aren't always together. And this tool makes sure that people remote to the project stay informed. So we talk about the construction activities that happened each week. We talk about the construction activities that are coming up. So if anyone that receives this report is interested in seeing a certain piece of the work go in, or maybe they're responsible for procuring a part of the work, it's identified here. We can update on the current contract amount. We can talk about the subs that are currently working on site, so that again, you're informed. You're aware of what's going on the site. And then we talk about milestones that we maybe have achieved and hit and demonstrate how we're proceeding on the schedule. And then I think the next page is a rendering of this project. So that's what the project will look like when it's complete. Really exciting project for us, and one of the ones that we wanted to profile here today, about $120 million healthcare facility right in downtown Jacksonville. If you're familiar with Jacksonville at all, I don't know if you are, right on I-95 as you go through the city there. And we hope to, because of how well we're doing on this project so far, hope to get another phase. By the way, just a quick interesting story. Everybody heard of Hurricane Irma, right? So that came through Florida and did a lot of destruction, devastation. In Jacksonville, what they had was a lot of flooding. And 2 days after Irma, the floodwaters were 2 feet high on the ground floor slab of this project and completely engulfed the project team trailers. So talk about lean and efficiency. That team has immediately organized an emergency response effort to not only recover the schedule and continue the work on the project, but they also organized an effort to help each other, because a lot of the people that lived there personally were impacted by the floodwaters. And in order to get people's mind off of that and having to deal with that, we sent some laborers were sent to help tarp roofs or remove trees from yards and things like that, to keep that team as highly functioning as possible while still being sympathetic to the devastation and the trauma that everybody went through. So just a kind of a current event update there on that project. But other than that, it's going to be a really exciting project to be proud of when we're done with it next year.
Okay, third point we wanted to highlight here is managing production and the importance of managing production. So when we talk about that in terms of planning, scheduling, production planning, and lean stuff, we're talking about, we want to make sure that all the partners are educated on production planning techniques, right? If folks are going to be doing production planning, they need to know how to do it. And it's not just getting more resources out to the job site because we're behind on schedule. It's really understanding what production means. And we'll dive into that a little bit here as we go through. And committing to weekly work plans. So every week, foremen will sit down and talk about what they're going to do either that week or the following week. And we'll commit to work that's going to be completed. And some of that goes back to the right people we were talking about earlier and that trust, right? If I can't trust that whatever commitment you're making on work that you're going to put in place is accurate, if I can't trust that, then I'm not going to have a very accurate commitment either, or I'm probably not going to commit to anything myself, right? So we start with the right people and the trust, but then here's where the rubber meets the road, right? We're going to be committing the work that we're doing, and we trust each other enough that we're going to be able to follow through with those commitments. Daily check-ins are certainly an important part of making sure that we're meeting our commitments. Removing roadblocks. When we talk about roadblocks, we're talking about things that are keeping you from meeting your commitment, right? So it could be a material that's in the way, keeping me from getting physically to the work site. It could be an answer that we're waiting on about a drawing clarification or a specification issue. Those are all things that are roadblocks, and we want folks to be able to see what those roadblocks are and then work to remove them rather than just stopping what's happening and throwing our hands up and saying, okay, I don't know what to do now, I'm going home, right? So it's about seeing them and then removing them. And of course, we want to track all of these things that we're talking about here today. There's measuring that's involved, and then doing something with those measurements, improving the process, making adjustments, not just keep doing the same thing that you're doing and repeating the same results if they're not the results that you want. And so when we talk about managing production, we're tracking production, we're going to measure it, we're going to use those results, we're going to improve the process. So one thing I did want to talk to you about in terms of production was our self-perform work. Dr. Patty mentioned that earlier. So yeah, one of my roles is at DPR is to work with our self-perform work groups. And what that means is DPR actually, we perform work on the job site with our own forces. We subcontract out a lot of the work, but a lot of the work we self-perform ourselves. That's just some quick numbers. 2,700 plus, that's actually how many craft workers that we have on our employee at DPR nationwide. 19 is the number of different scopes that we actually self-perform at DPR. One in particular, this number here, 3, is actually our rank in ENR. If we were to take our revenue for just drywall, framing and drywall, we'd be the 3rd largest wall and ceiling subcontractor in the nation. So we do a lot of self-perform work. We do a lot of framing and drywall. And there's a lot of good reasons why we do framing and drywall and self-perform it. And a lot of it has to do with this, with these principles that we're talking about. How many of you, you've all had internships and worked out, been out in the field and seen construction? What trade would you say is interacting the most with all the other trades on the job site? Any ideas? There's a hand.
From my experience, drywall.
Yeah, right. So the electrical trade also interacts a lot. They touch a lot of things as well. But framing and drywall touches a lot of the other trades and impacts the other trades. And so by us self-performing that and focusing on that ourselves, that gives us the most chance to impact the project in total, right? If we were just self-performing, let's say the flooring here, how many different trades does a flooring guy interact with? I mean, it's great that we can put the flooring down, but it's not really impacting the breadth of the project like the framing and drywall, right? So that's a little bit about our self-perform work. One thing I wanted to share, probably can't see everything that's on this slide, but what this is a production optimization tool. It's a score sheet, actually. So all of these lines here are different criteria that impact production on a job site. And there's a couple of different categories, things from an owner or architect, things that we have direct control with our own self-perform forces, and then things that are more project team, total team related. And I'll highlight a few of these, but the important thing here is that this is a way to measure the production, the things that are affecting production, put out a score, and then say, okay, well, if this is 70%, we're not really optimizing our production on a job. Where do we need to go and focus our time in order to optimize production on a job site? And so a couple things just to highlight that were on that production optimizer. Motivation and morale. Again, we're back to talking about people and behaviors. If people aren't motivated or if morale is bad on a job site, we're not going to be working the most efficiently. We're not going to be working the most productively. And so motivation and morale is a key contributor to getting the best production on a job site. Having the skilled labor and having it consistently available, right? So one of the issues that the construction industry as a whole is facing is just the supply of skilled craft labor in general. There's not enough to cover the jobs that there are to perform in the country. And so having the skilled labor that's needed and having it be consistently available, not coming in and out of the project, can affect production. Trade stacking and congestion of trade. So if everyone's working on top of each other, how efficient is that? How is anybody going to be good at installing the drywall or laying the floor or putting in the lights if there are 4 other trades and they're trying to do their work at the same time? So we want to be aware of trade stacking and having too many people in an area because that affects production on a job site. Overtime or shift work as well. So folks that are working overtime, a lot of overtime, or folks that are coming in on a second shift aren't going to be as productive as folks that are working standard 8-hour normal time frame. And so it may be necessary to work overtime on a job. It may be necessary because of the nature of the job to have to work a second shift or work at night because of noise or other things. But we need to be aware that that's going to then affect the production that we were going to see on the job site and plan for that appropriately. And out-of-sequence work as well. It's kind of similar to the trade stacking, but it's more about if I go over to one section of the building and do work, and then I got to go all the way over to the other side of the building to do work, and then I go upstairs, and then I come downstairs. That's not very effective or productive, right? It's not the most efficient way to work through a building, work through the construction. So working out of sequence affects production. Sometimes that's unavoidable because there may be a change in the work that's come from either the architect or the owner, or maybe some weather condition like a flood, causes you to work out of sequence. But the best plans and the best things are to remove those types of obstacles so that you're not working out of sequence on the job.
And then if they do happen, to quickly react.
Correct. And then sort of the last thing that I think is important to highlight on production and optimizing it is the ramping up, ramping down of the labor force. And another way to say that maybe is having the right amount of work released for the crew size that you have. So we don't want to have a work this week that needs 20 people. Next week it needs 40, and then the following week go back to 20. That's up and down. Where are we going to get those 20 people from? Are they really going to come to the job site and work for a week and then go home and and get us good work during that week? Are we going to be able to even find those 20 people to come for that peak, right? So this is probably one of the bigger issues with optimizing production is that ramping up and ramping down of the workforce. Having a steady flow of work for the crew size that we have is the best way to optimize production and efficiency on a job site. So you want to be careful of that. And some of that is impacted by these other things we talked about, working out of sequence or trade stacking. Some of those things could cause then spikes in manpower. But we don't want spikes in manpower. We want to stay level as we're working through a construction project. Any questions there? That was a lot of info, yes.
On the last point you said, do you guys find it easier to manage by giving, not saying to like give them less, but do you find it easier to plan with less laborers or less craft at first and then scale up in that period of time where you don't want to change the amount of people? Because I feel like generally if you plan for more and then trying to take away people is harder for the craft, like the crews to be okay with that or they not argue with your decision. Do you have a plan on how you scale up or scale down?
Yes. So very good point, and you're right. Adding along the way is probably better for the crew's morale because if they know that they're working on a job site where maybe there's more people than necessary, then they're always going to be wondering who's going to be let go today, and that's not very good for morale, right? But what you don't want to have is you don't want to sit there and work with such a small crew size that you don't keep up with the schedule. So production and schedule work together, right? If you want to be the most efficient as working through a project, But if you're efficient and you finish a year late and didn't meet the total time scale, then that's not really the goal either, right? And so there's a couple of ways, a couple of tools. Some of it is doing man loaders and things like